We were flying with SAM, Sociedad Aeronáutico de Medellín. It was a remarkable company, which went out of business after they crashed their last plane. They had supposedly repaired our plane during the 24-hour wait in San Andres. But as we flew through a storm to Cartagena, we happened to be opposite the crew kitchen. At one point, the curtain opened, and I saw water streaming in around the pressurized door, and the panic-stricken crew drinking large glasses of straight gin, small glasses of which they had just passed out to the passengers. Luckily, it was a very short flight and we made it. Then it was on to Barranquilla in a bus, where we stayed with the brother of Hans, who was my guide and tent boy on my climbing expedition to the Santa Marta Range of the year before. Hans and Klaus were German Colombians and spoke German, but were married into and absorbed by the local culture. While in Barranquilla, we went to the Venezuelan consulate to get a visa, and after waiting forever, found that we had to have a booked flight out of Venezuela to get a visa, even though we planned to cross into the country by bus. We bought one and returned just in time to get it that day.
Mariposas amarillas, Mauricio Babilonia. Mariposas amarillas que vuelan liberadas. Mariposas amarillas, Mauricio Babilonia. Mariposas amarillas que vuelan liberadas.
From Valledupar, we set off by cab, I think, to visit the village of San Sebastián in the Ardoac area of the Santa Marta Range of mountains, where I'd been climbing the year before. The dirt road was under heavy construction, and at the end we rented mules. On the trail, we met one of the men I had photographed the year before. I gave him a copy. He was pleased with it, but he asked me to take another one, this time of his whole body, so he crouched down to fit. The village is one that the Ardoacs only use for meetings. The year before it had been full of people, as they were choosing a new head for the tribe. This year there was just a family of white Colombians who had a store of sorts. This was new. The family was slaughtering a goat for Christmas, and Richie stumbled upon the scene. He stood and quietly stared. Afterwards he didn't mention it, even though he was extremely verbal. But 3 years later we were slaughtering a pig at Apple Hill, and he said, "That's just like the other time." And I knew that he had remembered the goat and the Santa Martas. We took a bus to Maicao, near the border with Venezuela. A pretty scary ride, because the buses would race each other at high speeds to get out of the other's dust, sometimes going full tilt side by side around blind corners. We took a cab into Venezuela because it was so late. We crossed sometime around midnight. And because it was almost Christmas, the driver was handing out aguinaldos. It's a Latin American tradition which often includes an extra month's salary. In this case, it was cartons of cigarettes to all the border guards. They were all laughing and joking and wishing the driver Merry Christmas and too distracted to bother checking our passports. So we passed into Venezuela with no entry visas. We stopped overnight in Maracaibo with Bruce and Mehdi, friends from Bolivia. The symphony in Maracaibo had recruited nearly half its players from Poland. So after the conductor gave an instruction, a Pole would stand up and translate it into Polish. Bruce, an American, played horn. I went to a rehearsal. It sounded pretty good. Mehdi, from Uruguay, his wife, was in a theater group, and one day she went to a rehearsal and no one else was there. The next day they said, it rained. Different culture. We left Caracas by bus. We were heading to Guiria on the east coast of the country to take a ferry to Trinidad. It took quite a while, and we ended up hitchhiking most of the way. One of the rides took us to their house where they ran a small hotel. We heard Mariposas Amarillas on the car and truck radios constantly. We had a lot of beach time in these days and took a ferry to the island Margarita to see the Spanish fort San Carlos de Borromeo. We got one ride in an oil tanker and the driver was seat dancing to the boleros on the radio. He was really good. I can remember his upper body dance moves really clearly.
Remolino de recuerdo, la tristeza de Aureliano es cuatro, la belleza de Remedio violines, la pasión de Amaranta guitarra, el embrujo de Melquiades oboe, Úrsula 100 años, Soledad Macondo, Úrsula 100 años, Soledad Macondo, eres epopeya del pueblo olvidado, forjado en 100 años de amor esa historia. Eres epopeya del pueblo olvidado, forjado en 100 años de amor esa historia. Te imagino y vuelve a vivir en mi memoria quemada al sol. Mariposas amarillas.
We got to Guiria and found out that the ferry only sailed on Thursdays, and we arrived on a Friday. They hadn't mentioned the schedule in Caracas. They probably didn't know it. We found a small hotel and spent the days at the beach and going to see really terrible movies at the little movie theater in town. Finally, Thursday came, and we went to the ferry dock. The boat was there, but they weren't sailing because there weren't enough passengers. Try again next week. The nearest airport was in Medellin, a long ways away. We had the ticket to Trinidad that we bought to get the visa that it turned out we didn't use. We stood there thinking about possibilities when we were approached by a young man who asked us if we needed a boat to Trinidad. We said yes, and he said his boss had a boat up the coast. We arranged to meet him in the afternoon. We went back to the hotel and told the woman owner. She was horrified. No, don't go with them. They're smugglers. They will take you to deep water, steal your money, and kill you with knives and throw you overboard. Everyone knows this. We talked it over, and I said that I didn't believe her and thought we should check it out. Jimena agreed hesitantly. Mariposas amarillas. We met the young man, and he took us in a pickup truck to a settlement of a few houses up the coast. Mauricio Babilonia. The boss, El Jefe, was one of the most inherently powerful people I have ever met. Mariposas amarillas. He owned everything there. As if as a symbol, he owned the only light bulb. His days were spent grooming his birds for cockfighting. His enormous belly notwithstanding, I wouldn't have faced him in a ring. The boat coming back from Trinidad was late, so we waited an extra day or so. He let us sleep in a house near his. I think we were surviving on peanut butter sandwiches. The deal, we began to learn, was that the passengers/smugglers entered Trinidad legally, bought trade goods, mostly textiles, and then smuggled them back into Venezuela to later sell them without paying the steep tariffs. Jimena made friends with a Venezuelan woman who was also going on the boat, who had a toddler, and learned from her that she was only paying $50. We had agreed to $75. I got my courage up and approached El Jefe. "The others are only paying $50, I said. He looked at me with his steely black eyes and said, "Tu precio es 75. I felt like if he kept looking at me like that, I would become powerless and my bones would turn to syrup. I wrenched myself free from his stare and said quickly, "Oh, okay, no hay problema." It was late afternoon when the boat finally arrived. They had had outboard motor problems. Uh-oh. When we left, it was nearly dark, and the motor conked out not 100 meters from shore. The same young man who had brought us to this place swam back for a part for the motor and an extra oar. We only had one. Double uh-oh. We set off finally, and were cruising along. The boatman was like a character from a solo show called Caribbean Man. He had cut-off pants, an open collar white shirt, and a ring of beard about his chin. He was extremely handsome, and he saved our lives. I was lulled into a kind of dreamy state. I had Richie in my lap. Jimena was under a tarp with her friend, protected from the small amount of spray. I was loving the starlight on the water and watching the Caribbean Man standing up in the back of the boat with the tiller in his hand. What I didn't realize was that we were traveling along the Paria Peninsula, completely protected by it. Sometime near midnight, we entered the open ocean between the end of the peninsula and Trinidad. The waves became quite large, and we were crashing down one and up another, and Richie and I were totally soaked. I tightened my grip around him. He, of course, was fast asleep. "This is great," I said to myself. Then the motor conked out. We were in trouble. Without the motor, we were turning sideways to the waves. We would be swamped, miles from shore with no life preservers. I watched as Caribbean Man in the stern pulled on the starter cord, without panic, but with extreme intensity. We were inches from swamping when the motor caught, and he turned us into the waves, and we were saved. It was at once terrifying, exciting, and exhilarating. You wouldn't be watching this and hearing this story if the motor hadn't started. But having survived, I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Mariposas amarillas, Mauricio Babilonia. Mariposas amarillas, que vuelen liberadas. Trinidad was nice. The people are extremely friendly. We bought a series of plane tickets because there was no road connection between the three Guyanas. And again, you couldn't get a visa in without a plane ticket out. So we bought Trinidad, Georgetown, Georgetown, Paramaribo, Paramaribo, Cayenne, and Cayenne back to Cartagena. We had our ticket home from Cartagena, and we would later cash in our Caracas, Trinidad ticket because we never officially entered or left Venezuela. At this point, we began to run seriously low on money. We went to the races, and one evening took a flat-bottom boat into the mangrove swamps to watch the flamingos returning to roost in the trees for the night. The egrets came first, but unfortunately the flamingos waited until dusk to arrive. We saw it, but my film could not. The mangroves looked like Christmas trees filled with thousands of bright red lights. Amazing. Georgetown was a great place to wander around. The wooden houses and the whole feel of the place was British colonial, just as the other two Guyanas turned out to be Dutch and French colonial. My old Chilean friend Sergio Ovalle had recommended them as really different from the rest of South America. We tried to get a flight on a tiny airplane to see Kaitour Falls out in the rainforest, but they were booked solid. Disappointing. One day we took the ferry over the Demerara River to the east of the city and wandered into an old wooden church where we met the pastor, Reverend Bassant of St. Swithin's Rectory. He gave us tea. Then the last thing we did was take a boat up the river to an Amerindian, as they call them, village. It was an early example of ecotourism, but the Amerindians were very friendly and not yet really used to tourists. We flew on to Paramaribo in Suriname and quickly got a room in the cheapest hotel in town, $3. We should have known something was wrong when they asked us if we wanted it for the whole night. But I thought it was a language barrier thing. I have no Dutch. Well, the walls of the cubicles did not go all the way to the floor, and soon the activities in the other rooms got quite loud and distracting. There was only one bed, and it filled the space. Richie is a flailer, and he kept us up all night rolling madly into us fast asleep, while we tried to shut out the sounds of passion all around us. It was cheap, but not worth it. Next morning we found another place. We walked all over that beautiful town, saw some cricket, which was incomprehensible, lily pads, and walked way out in the country on dirt roads. We found the central market and bought curried peanut butter, the best I've ever had. Lots of South Asians there. Then the luckiest thing ever happened to us. We were at the tourist bureau asking about trips upriver, and the woman said that the person in charge was sick and had gone back to Holland. But wait, the boatman is here in the office. Just make arrangements with him. We talked to the boatman, John. He didn't have much English, but he invited us to go upriver with him. There was a cabin near a village that the woman in the tourist office was trying to rent out. We could stay there. We would pay him something for the ride. It all seemed like destiny. We met him the next day and rode on a microbus on rails. They jacked it up and turned it around for the return trip. Our boat was a dugout canoe, just like the ones in the Brazilian forest I studied about in 5th grade, Pimwi. Actually, it turned out to be just like in the jungles of West Africa. The only difference was an outboard motor instead of paddles. We were about to visit a village of the Matawai, the name of their tribe and their language. In the late 1600s, Their ancestors were slaves brought by the English and Dutch to work the plantations which occupied the narrow arable plain by the coast. Due to the incredible cruelty of the masters, many of the slaves escaped, and using the skills they had from growing up in Africa, fled up the river. The river had shallow but impassable rapids, at least for the Dutch soldiers who pursued them, and they were never captured. Finally, the Dutch signed a treaty deeding all of the interior worthless land to the Maroons, as they called them. The slaves recreated a West African culture in the interior of Suriname, and most amazingly, created their own language, made up of English, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, all the slave languages, and also of the many African languages from the villages they had been captured from. They called themselves Matawai. The other three major rivers each had their own language. When we reached the rapids, the outboard motor came up, and John and Fry, his assistant, poled us up the river, just the way they did back in the 1600s. Fry became a favorite of Richie's. The cabin was great. It was right across the river from the village. We went swimming in the river and little fishes were nibbling at my legs. Not biting, just nibbling. Little piranhas, said John. Yikes. Henrik, a young boy who lived in the village, took us across the river to visit the next morning. He spoke really good English and was really our translator. It was like stepping back in time to Africa of centuries ago, with a veneer of the 20th. The school was taught in Dutch, being part of French Guyana or Suriname, but everything else was old. The people were very friendly and fascinated by Richie, who always served as our ambassador. One really cool interlude was between Richie and a topless older woman. She held out a banana for him and indicated that she would trade it for the bottle cap he had in his hand. He shook his head several times. He preferred the bottle cap. Finally, she just handed him the banana with a laugh. And then Richie, living up to the agreement, even though he hadn't really accepted it, handed her the bottle cap. The crowd loved it. One day a man showed up at the cabin with a haunch from some animal. "What is it?" I asked. "Pingo," said John. I noticed it had a cloven hoof. After a while, searching for common words, we found out it was a tapir. John made a stew. It was very tasty. The village woodcarver made Richie a pingo, which he gave to him. He also sold us a typical small bench, which we carried with us for the rest of the trip. One memorable night, we were invited to the school and sat in the flickering lantern light, entranced, as the children and some adults sang song after song at full volume. It seemed that most of the songs were in Dutch, but there could have been old African songs mixed in. We were in a different world. We spent many wonderful days there, and at the end, John invited us to his village, 4 more days up the river. "We will give you a house and food. You can live with us for as long as you like." If I hadn't been a musician with an orchestra job, I would have gone, spent a year, learned the language, then written the book. Oh well. On the way down river, suddenly Fry was yelling, "Aboma! Aboma!" I didn't see anything, and so John circled back to show us a dead anaconda floating in the river. You could see that it had just eaten something, possibly some farmer's sheep, and presumably the farmer had killed it and thrown it in the river. This is what I gleaned from the other passengers. It was hard saying goodbye to John and Fry, but what an experience. Mariposas amarillas, Mauricio Babilonia. Mariposas amarillas que vuelan liberadas. We met Moise Glazé and his family in the airport in Cayenne. They lived in Kourou, northeast of the capital, where the European Space Center was located. He worked there. And since we told him we planned to take the boat to Devil's Island, which launched from Kourou, they invited us to stay with them. Maurice dropped us at the dock early the next morning. The captain of the boat was an old Guyana hand. He told us tales of giant mantas leaping over his boat and knew the stories from Devil's Island intimately. He told us that probably all the incidents in that book happened, but not all to Papillon, as he was a liar and a self-promoter. The administration building had been turned into a nice auberge with good food. Richie and I wandered all over the island. Jimena was not really interested. I marveled at how the jungle in only 27 some years had nearly destroyed the old buildings. I could pick out most of the ones featured in the book. We also found the spot where he supposedly jumped into the ocean with his raft of coconut shells on the 7th wave to avoid being crushed against the rocks. There were no big waves, and you could have launched a child's sailboat safely. Oh well. The family took us to a French Chinese restaurant, which at the time I thought had the best food I had ever eaten. Of course, we'd been surviving on peanut butter sandwiches. I remember a fried pastry filled with chocolate. Oh, yeah. In Cartagena, we met Hans' sister Elsa and her family and stayed with them. They took us to see the old Portuguese fort and then to a nightclub where we danced to, you guessed it, Macondo. Then home. I don't think I had more than $3 in my pocket at that time.